Good morning and welcome to AT Talks, a collaboration between the Michigan Assistive Technology Loan Fund, MI-UCP, and Disability Rights Michigan. I'm Tracy Strading, Director of the MATLF. First, some housekeeping items. Please type your questions into the QA or chat boxes or raise your hand so that we can unmute you to ask a question aloud. You may enter your questions during the presentation, but they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. If you're using a screen reader, I'll drop a PDF of the presentation into the chat shortly. I'm happy to introduce our speaker, Jacqueline Kaufman. She's a pediatric clinical rehabilitation neuropsychologist and associate professor at the University of Michigan, Department of Physical Medicine of Michigan Adaptive Cognitive Assessment Clinic. Oh, I said that wrong. I apologize. I'm having one of those mornings. She is the oh, you can't hear me? Oh, okay. All right. She is the founder and director of the University of Michigan Adaptive Cognitive Assessment Clinic, a clinic serving patients with severe motor and speech impairments, precluding participation in traditional neuropsychological assessments. She's the co-founder of the Ann Arbor Rockets ice hockey team for children and adults with neurodevelopmental disabilities and is the proud current board chair and longstanding board member of MI-UCP. Today, Dr. Kaufman will present on transition planning advocacy tips and tricks for educational settings. And Dr. Jack, I'll let you clean up whatever I missed in that presentation before you get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. It was perfect. Perfect. Thank you so much. And I'm so honored to be here. And what I'll do today is give you a bit of a survey of a lot of different areas. And because it's a survey, there's going to be a few areas that I just really hone in on in my talk. And the rest will be a little bit more light. And if you have questions for more details in those areas, of course, you'll add it in the chat, and I'm happy to answer them at the end. So I'm going to share my screen, which we've done successfully mere moments ago. So here's to hoping. Yep, looks like you're seeing the right thing. I'm going to just get started. To start just first, I have no real disclosures or conflicts to report as Tracy so kindly pointed out. I am a very proud long-term board member for MI-UCP and hope that you will take the opportunity, if you don't already know about our services and programs, to check them out. Look at the website, call our offices, and learn more about the amazing, wonderful things that happen at MI-UCP, from loans to advocacy and everything in between. We're here to help you, your family, loved ones, and if you are a teacher, a provider, a community member who wants to learn more about disability resources, please reach out and we would love to talk with you. Today, in terms of objectives, I'm hoping that if you are not already familiar with these things, that you will, when done, be able to describe some high-tech and low-tech examples of assistive technology, identify some partners within IEP teams, and really, frankly, more broadly in the schools and the community amongst your provider network who can facilitate assistive technology implementation. And then describe some of the resource strategies for primary and secondary educational settings. I will be focusing today really heavily on some of the earlier resources because I think that's where it's like a crash course for anybody who's in a space of needing these resources. So that's, I think, often where the most support is needed. So when talking about assistive technology, and I am, as a person who deals with this a lot in my life, just as guilty of this, I always picture things that are on the screen. Things like, EEG caps for complex brain-computer interface and talker devices and eye trackers and visual aids for enlarging and all of these things. But really what assistive technology is also this stuff: pencil grippers, curved utensils for assisting with eating with mobility difficulties, grabbers, slant boards. My favorite, the Post-it note, is my assistive technology pick for all things. So it's important to remember that there are low tech and high tech and really middle tech versions of assistive technology. And as we're talking about things today, I want us to really be mindful that assistive technology is not something that's necessarily expensive or fancy or has to be something that's ordered through insurance. It can be very basic. Assistive technology definitionally is a product or a system or equipment that improves function or maintains function or increases access, specifically for individuals with disabilities in order to maximize their participation and function. And like I said, I feel like examples in my mind that I always tell people are like a screen reader or dictation software. A wheelchair is an assistive technology. I think people often forget that. An adapted car is assistive technology, an AC device, like I said, a grabber. It's usually a lot broader than people are thinking about when they say assistive technology. I do want to take a minute and talk about universal design because I think that this is another space that the people who are on this care about disability advocacy, either for themselves, for someone they love, for their community neighbors. And universal design, while not assistive technology, is an important sister or cousin of assistive technology. They're friends, and I think that we need to equally advocate in our communities for universal design. So, what is universal design? It's a philosophy. It's a way of thinking, and it's a philosophy of environments and spaces and product designs that are intended to be usable by everybody without the need to modify or adapt. Examples include things like audiobooks. I don't personally have dyslexia or a vision impairment that precludes me from reading a book or a movement difficulty that makes it hard for me to hold a book, but I sure love an audiobook. And it's equally accessible to me as somebody who may have all of those things that I just described. A curb cut, a ramp, these are universal designs. They make the world accessible to everybody and make it better. Just this weekend, I took my dad to see the wonderful movie Naked Gun. And we went to a theater that I called ahead to find out because I was nervous. He uses a walker. And has a lot of walking and balance difficulties. And I was concerned when I only saw 4 handicap accessible seats in the theater that were listed specifically as handicap accessible. And I called to find out when reserving my seat where I would be able to get in where he could go with his walker, particularly in a dark theater where he's more likely to fall. And the woman said, "There are no steps in our theater. It's all flat and ramped and angled." This is an example of universal design. That theater is accessible to everyone. And also, they have specific seats that are designated to be available for people who maybe are bringing their own seating in the form of a wheelchair and want to sit next to somebody who is going to use one of the provided seats. So that's how you should be thinking about universal design. Other examples, closed captioning, like flat panel light switches that are easy to turn on and off with less precision. Tactile pavement marks. We don't have this so much in America, but in Europe, these are all over the place. Some communities in the United States have these, but they make it easier for everybody. Both assistive technology and universal design target accessibility and inclusion for people with disabilities. And in an ideal world, you have universal design principles that are applied wherever it's viable to increase our environmental access for everybody. And then assistive technology is used to cover any of the remaining accessibility challenges that a person may need covered because of a disability in order to have full participation. So these two things complement each other. And so we should be ideally advocating for both of these things. So another thing to think about is, how do we classify function? Um, I'm going to speak briefly, excuse me, about the ICF model, the International Classification of Functioning and Disability and Health, Disability and Health, shortened ICF. And you see this model on the left of your screen. And what is important about this model is that there's lots of bidirectional arrows you see there. And I'm going to talk about them in a minute. Just a little background first. The International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health was developed by the World Health Organization and approved in 2001 at the World Health Assembly. And it was intended to complement what's called the International Classification of Diseases. This is what, when you go to your doctor for, a hangnail, they have a code in the ICD for hangnail. And they have a code for everything. There's a code for getting hit by a meteor. There's codes for everything that could happen to you in terms of your health. And so that's very helpful when thinking about diseases. But what the ICF does is the focus is shifted from diseases to things like body functions and structures, activities and participation, the severity and degree of the condition, and the environment in which the person exists. This is a far more holistic approach, because all facets of the person, and not just the diagnosis, are what we're talking about, how we're describing what this individual needs. And the reason this is really important about the rest of what I'm going to be talking about is, I would propose that if we all used this strategy for talking about disability in the school setting, in the workplace, when we're talking about transition planning, then it would go a lot better. When we talk about diseases, we are missing a lot about the person we're talking about. I had been recently on a plane and I overheard someone behind me who had just visited their nephew, and they said, he's a spina bifida. And it took everything in me to not turn around and say to this person, excuse me, I don't know what a spina bifida looks like. It's sort of like saying I was walking down the street and I said hi to a stapler. Like a person isn't a spina bifida. A person may have spina bifida, but spina bifida presents very differently. Some people walk, use the washroom, and move through space without any sort of difficulty. Some people have marked mobility difficulties, use a wheelchair, and have to use a catheter to manage their bowel and bladder needs. So it's a strange way to describe a person by a disease label. And what is interesting further is, we only do this for things that we would typically identify as disabilities. So I have eczema, and it would be less likely that a person would say she's an eczema. They would say, I'm a person who has eczema, but I would be this person moving through space first. By using the International Classification of Functioning model, it reminds everyone in the room, as we're talking about resource, planning for a student, for a young adult, to take a holistic approach and see the person first, see that their needs are also a function of their environment. So if we return to that model and look, you can see that it's organized based on body function and structure, so discussing the physiological and anatomical aspects of the body, including impairments that affect those functions. It's including activities and participation. In fact, this is the core of this model. What is their ability to perform activities and participate in life situations, including restrictions or limitations? What are the environmental factors? So the external factors that hinder or facilitate function. The physical environmental factors, so are there stairs or a ramp? What are the social and attitudinal factors? So stairs are only a problem if you can't get up them. If you live in a community where if you happen to be a wheelchair user and you pull up and there's 2 steps up, and it is the standard of that community that people, complete strangers, would just stop, help you up the stairs and continue on their way, those stairs aren't a barrier because there is a social and attitudinal arrangement in that environment that says you participate, you are engaged in the activity that is at the top of those stairs, and immediately that's just how that works. So we want to separate out physical, social, attitudinal, because all of those factors affect bidirectionally your activities and participation. And then there's personal factors, your internal factors that affect your functioning, your age, if you're younger, maybe you're more spry than if you're at the tail end of things and it's harder for you to do different activities. Your gender, you may have different strength abilities, size differences based on your gender, coping styles. Some people are master copers, some people don't have terrific coping, all of these things, a person's people are varied as the stars, right? So all of those things interact to determine the ability to participate and engage in activities. This is a classification system. So just be aware, I'm describing this thing to you. It's not something you would just like say, oh, we should use this in IEPs. This is a classification system in the way that like the billing classification system is that I described. It's got all of these crazy like numbers and systems and coding and all of this. And I'm not presenting it to you for that reason. I am presenting it to you because as we talk about these next steps, it is an ideal model for remembering the whole person and remembering the whole person within the context of their environment and other factors. And so with this as our backdrop, I'll continue with the other elements of what we're talking about. So I wanted to start first by talking about early education, because I think the greatest needs for assistive technology and for intervention are often in these, packed into this early phase when you have particularly like a childhood onset disability. Um, and when we're talking about early phases, we're talking about infants, toddlers, kids in very early education. Many times for parents and communities, the the person that we're working with, this may be the first person in the family. This may be a rare condition. So everything is new. And I always tell parents, oh, you didn't get the manual when you left the hospital. There's no manual for this. While no child is off the shelf, having a child with a disability, we just want to remember for the parents we're working with that, this, you didn't get a manual. So a lot of these services are new in this early phase. So we want to advocate by asking how assistive technology can be used to increase independent exploration and learning in infants and toddlers. We can do this when working with early intervention. So services like Early On, which is free, ages 0 to 3. It's part of our federal resources, at least currently. And this is how we make sure that young children have access to the best opportunities to grow and to grow well. Infants and toddlers use their hands, their feet, knees, their eyes, their ears, and their mouths to do a good chunk of their exploring. But for children with disabilities, it's important to consider what access is environmentally, physically, or socially that's cut off from natural access because maybe they have trouble using their hands or, getting on their feet and knees, using their eyes, ears, and mouths. Does that limit their access to information that they need to grow? And since exploration is typically through movement and touch and mouthing paired with visualizing in the environment, what are the ways that we can artificially use assistive technology to create those links for kids who may not be able to do that exploring on their own? So I thought a good example, and again, I just want to remind you, this is not exhaustive by any stretch. I tried to pick examples that felt the most salient so that you can use it in your head as the model and then apply it for other conditions and situations. So I thought the example of children with visual impairments is a really good one to get your creative juices going. So for infants with visual impairments, they have an added hurdle in early development because there is less intrinsic motivation visually to move and explore. A lot of what drives infant movement, aside from like the initial just squirmy movement that infants have ideally early on, the drive to move is often pushed by seeing things in the environment they want to get to. So for kids who don't have access to seeing what's around them, that drive isn't there to start moving towards things. The other thing that kids with visual impairments don't get the same access to is visual feedback of parent reactions to movement. So if children do pretty much anything, grown-ups around them pretty much freak out and cheer and clap and make ridiculous noises and faces. And for kids who can't see that, they're not getting the same number quantity of cues and prompts that what they're doing is favorable. So that's another area that we need to think about. Well, how else could I be giving feedback that what they're doing is something I want them to do more of, that I think is really great. Because we do those things as adults around infants very naturally. When we have to modify it, it becomes more thoughtful and deliberate. And so giving feedback about children having movements toward moving is something we want to be thinking about for kids who have vision impairments. The other thing that happens is observational learning is cut off in many ways for much of the day-to-day operations, because a lot of what we do day to day is silent unless we make a deliberate effort to give a running narrative of what's happening in the space. For children who are very young, like infants, even giving a running narrative isn't sufficient because they don't know language yet. So once they learn language, that's a lot more helpful. But prior to that, you could talk all day and they're still not getting the full richness of what's happening in their environment to just learn and watch. A child who is blind is not going to have the same opportunity as a sighted peer to see when the dog jumps up onto the couch, it knocks the pillow off. Something like that, learning about gravity, learning about concepts of space and location and relative location. These are all skills we need for math down the road. So all of these kinds of early learning concepts need to be artificially introduced if your access point of vision is cut off. Vision also helps with our spatial orientation from a physical perspective. So our postural stability needed for higher level mobility is supported by being able to see how we are situated in space. So if I'm looking straight ahead of me and suddenly a sight line starts going, I'm tipping over. That's me making connections with my balance systems to know right before my face hit the floor, I was getting this sort of change in my visual perceptual frame of where things were relative in space. If you can't see, you lose these things. And so your balance and vision and your stability posturally are different. So we can use assistive technology to help with this. And remember, it doesn't have to be fancy. An infant doesn't want fancy. Rattles and musical toys can help start to create an understanding of differential locations, near and far, shaking it near and far, shaking two different rattles in different spaces to give three-dimensional localization. Physical books that have pages read aloud. Toys that have texture. We can even start introducing Braille characters and apps for early exposure. You're not expecting the child to learn how to Braille at this age, but this is no different than when we sit with a young child who can't even understand words and we read books to them, little board books. We do this all the time. We introduce language and text and reading to very young children before they have any capacity, but we're building the framework. We're less likely to do this with kids who can't see, but they need it even more. So a book can be an assistive technology, a Braille book, helping them starting to feel and be interested in understanding that that process of touching and feeling bumps is tied to the experience of listening to the cadence of a book. We want high contrast toys. Remember, most people who are blind have some vision. So we want to maximize that. High contrast toys, inset puzzle games, and something that we want to think about is requesting visual impairment, orientation, mobility consultations for the home space. You know, see if there's apps. There's the Exploring Braille with Madeline and Ruff. It's an app. There's all of these things that you can be asking for and see how you can adjust your space. The other major milestone early on is choice making. So we usually learn how to make choices by doing an action and getting feedback about what happens after that action. So you touch a hot stove, it hurts. If you hit your brother, someone yells no or stop it. If you crawl off the couch face first instead of feet first, you land on your face. Next time you're scared and you turn it around and you change your strategy. For kids who have severe motor impairments, for example, choices are made for them. Moving around and doing things on your own may not be a possibility. So people bring choices to you. But one of the problems with this is that if people are only bringing you choices, then they're not going to bring you something that you don't like. You would, as a parent, you would be a jerk, right? To say, like, I'm going to bring my kid two things to pick, and I know they're not going to like one. Who would do such a thing? That seems cruel. In fact, it is very kind to do this for a child who has severe motor impairments, because if you let them pick between a couple choices and some of those choices are not favorable, and you make them sit with their choice, the idea and concept of choice making will start to click. This is how we gain autonomy. So autonomy is our ability to choose, to organize and direct our environment. What we want to avoid is a situation where someone is 5, 10, 15 years old, and they've not ever really made a choice. It's always been pre-selected for them without ever the opportunity to learn that there's actual consequences for your choices. The reason this is really important is if you can learn that you make a choice, something happens. And I will often teach this in my clinic for people who have more severe motor impairments as young as possible. If I hit this button, this TV comes on. There's a response, there's a consequence. Or more complicated, I'm going to give you two choices. If you hit this button, you will get the fun football game, Packers, up on the screen. If you hit this button, I'm going to play a video of a dripping faucet. It's not as exciting, but we want to give kids the opportunity to learn that choice making will affect their environment. I will always make sure you have something that is a not so good choice so that you can learn to pay better attention to what you're doing, because this is relevant. This has valence that's relevant. If you can start to make those choices, then correct decision making is an important next step at this early age. Teaching the concepts of yes and no, true or false, is important. Is this a ball? Is this a puppy? We want kids to be able to understand what yes and no are. And that we change it up and give them choices that they can get wrong. Because getting it wrong is an opportunity for us to correct it. One of the things we want to think about is how choice making is relevant and important in assistive technology. So think about common relevant technologies like an augmentative communication device, like a talker, such as an iPad that has LAMP or Proloquo to go on it, something like this, where a person uses a talker device and there's icons and they touch them and it talks on their behalf. There's some pitfalls with some of this in thinking that a device like that is the answer. And I see this often clinically where a kid is handed an iPad with these things loaded on and they're sent on their way. People aren't trained how to use it. The family isn't trained how to use it. It's far too complicated. The child's not ready. So when we think about these devices, we can fool ourselves into thinking that this person understands what choice making is, but they may not, because it only has what's programmed in it. They don't have a choice. If they're pre-literate, they can't type a choice. What they're doing is just using the icons available. And some of this can be practiced and habituated into a habit without really understanding what is being done. I watch a lot of people give devices to kids, parents, teachers, loved ones. A child will hit a button and then the parent or teacher will say, "Are you being silly? That's not what you meant." This is the downfall of these devices, because if we keep cycling through this, "you're being silly," until the person hits on the one that the parent wants, who made the choice? We need to really make sure that the person understands whatever they hit on that device, that is what we're going to take it as fact. That word that they put in there is what we're going with. We have to be careful to not overinterpret. That can happen a lot, where teachers or parents may say, "Oh, what they mean from that is this. That's what you think they mean." We need to make sure we're working towards having that person give us the maximal information possible using the device, that we are confident beyond a doubt that they are saying what we think they're saying, and that we're not overly interpreting on their behalf. Schools and providers often will request or order the best and newest device. And unfortunately, that can be before the person's ready to use it. So eye gaze or talkers that are very complicated, but maybe not the right time for this person, because what they're trying to do, and understandably, given the way insurance works, is get ahead of it. I can't order another one for another 3 to 5 years, so I'm going to get the very best one now, knowing they'll grow into it. It doesn't mean that that's like the best choice. It may be wait to even order it, but start with something really basic, like like a picture exchange system, a communication board that's just a paper one that we can ramp up as we know that they have reliable choice making, that they know how to use it, and that they are directing their communication. We also need partners in facilitating choice making to use these kinds of devices. The parent and caregiver has to know how to do it. The teachers, you can pull in psychologists and behavioral specialists to train the behaviors of choice making. Speech pathologists, pediatric speech pathologists can be expert in this, particularly when they have backgrounds in assistive communication devices. Occupational therapists, ABA therapists are very good at this. All parties have to be on the same page. If there is a weak link, the system can fall apart. And so more is better in this example. If we move into more of a solid elementary education and think about what are the needs in that setting, let's continue on this theme of sensory disorders. So in the classroom, there's a lot of noise and it can be visually distracting and a lot going on. So we want to think about, do we have interpreter services available for this individual? These are relevant if a person uses sign in any format. We want to make sure interpreters are certified and trained. I've sat in on a lot of IEPs, unfortunately, where this is not something that is prioritized, and the level of training and certification will be too low for the needs of that individual, and there won't be adequate training in sign and in use of interpreters built into the IEP. I would say that part of this is a financial problem. A lot of schools will be in financial straits. My response for parents is, that's not your problem. But realistic me says it's everybody's problem. So I don't have a great solution, but it is important that we advocate. And if you have a student or child with this need, it's important to reach out to advocacy groups that can help you, because not having interpreters appropriately trained and certified, right leveled, all of that can interfere with learning dramatically. For students, many students have hearing impairments who don't use interpreters, and there are many supports that are still needed in the classroom. Preferred seating, prompts and repetition, environmental noise control is important. White noise comes from things like computers in the classroom, classroom fans, ambient noise from other devices or hallways. Um, some students benefit from sound field systems. This is an example of a universal design. So speakers around the class amplify the teacher's voice, and this benefits all students. This isn't specific to the student who has a disability. Remote microphones transmit the teacher's voice directly to the student's hearing device. This is really great for a noisy classroom environment, but it has downsides. And something to think about getting built into an IEP is what happens when a classmate raises their hand and says something? That isn't piped directly into the student's ears. So now they're missing out on observational learning, um, side conversations that enhance learning, and participating in group conversations that are so essential for setting that student up for success in junior and high school, and ultimately in the work environment where we have to work in groups and hear how that process goes. The other thing is closed caption. Again, this is good for everybody. But what about pre-literate students? You can't use closed caption in a kindergarten and expect that to be the solution. What about a dyslexic student? You're allowed to have dyslexia as a child who has a hearing impairment. These, you aren't just relegated to one disability. You're allowed to have more than one. Um, and it's important, as kids become literate, to make sure that kids have access to copies of notes and outlines so that they know what they're listening for. For kids who have vision impairments, um, it's important to know this is the most expensive support that a school offers under an IEP. This is the most costly to a school district. Again, nobody's problem but the school districts. But know that the supportive devices are often the most expensive that will be used under any IEP. Um, Students with vision impairments need preferred seating. They benefit from tactile material, magnification, assistive lighting devices, including things that reduce glare, larger print, high contrast. So these like kind of modifications to the size and quality of the visual input. Um, Remember that when you enlarge print, you now have access to the individual thing you're looking at, but you lose the bigger picture. So it takes more time to examine and explore. So if you're, for example, taking an exam, you need to add time because it will take that person longer to see the full picture. They can see better, but less at once. Screen readers, brailler devices were relevant. There's high-tech stuff like optical character recognition software. This stuff changes printed words into digital text that can be turned to audio or enlarged or modified the way any other printed text is. Audiobooks, labeling spaces and layouts. Some particularly European, but there's other places that have this. Outside of washrooms, there's not just a little braille sign that says this is a washroom, but there's a layout, because if you walk in and there's a bunch, it's classroom passing a lot of time. You can feel where the stalls are, how it's oriented, where are the sinks. You can have this as a tactile layout outside of washrooms and in new conference rooms, or in labs in the high school setting, things like this. But having visual layouts that are tactily available is helpful, and then making sure that orientation and mobility is a piece of that IEP. For kids with movement disorders, participation is very dependent on the affected body parts and the severity. So we would want OT and PT consultations and services. Those are our partners in planning. We want to think about things like adaptive writing devices, like from both a mechanical and electronic standpoint. So, from something basic like a pencil grip, or looking at a modified pencil grip for weak hand strength, using dictation software, You have to bear in mind it's not a solution for everybody. If you have, for example, cerebral palsy with dysarthric speech, dictation software may not be your friend. It may be a source of frustration. Typing instead of writing, use of switch devices, and then copies of notes and material. I always think about for kids with movement disorders, the importance of including things like adapted gym. Everyone should be playing. There's no reason everyone shouldn't be playing. Things like personal care. How much can that person do independently without an aid if the environment and physical space is accessible? Let's think back to our international classification of function. If the environment is modified, that person may not actually need any assistance. So, what about accessible playgrounds? Suddenly, maybe they don't need the aid right next to them all the time. Maybe the aid can kind of get out of the way a little bit. For kids with cognitive disabilities, we may want to use low-tech strategies to increase structure and have those go between home and school so that the parent can use that as well. We can scaffold tasks into steps with pictures, use visual calendars, repetition, multiple choice. I'm a big fan of things like laminated vocabulary cards on a key ring that's tied to a book bag that you can book bags often with a kid. You can take 5 words, practice it right before going in the hallway to change classes. It's on the same bag that goes home. Mom and dad can do that when it's time to get off the bus. Um, Picture exchange systems for communicating needs and wants before needing to worry about an augmentative communication device that's more complicated that other people may not know how to use. And then facilitating implementation by including special education teachers, school psychologists, speech pathologists, the parents, really have the full team involved. For learning disorders, there's a lot of supports in elementary school for assistive technology, multimodal teaching. There's things like Orton Gillingham and Linda Mood Bell for multimodal approaches for phonics and comprehension. Whole word reading is an option using like sight words, audiobooks, use them all the time. It's great for students with dyslexia or learning problems. E-readers where you're reading it and it's saying it at the same time. Using dictation software so that you're not having to write. If you have all the good thoughts up there, get them out. Doesn't matter if you can't write or spell. Typing, and then again, using our OT resource, speech therapy, literacy specialists, making sure we have all the people in the room. For math difficulties, we can make sure early in elementary we're training numeracy through using manipulatives, dot math, all these different ways to teach these concepts. With the transition to middle school, I feel that it's very important at that point, now that we've had this introduction, all of these technologies and strategies, this is where the application hits the road. So pre-meetings with all teachers, and if possible, include the student in these meetings. Even if there's pretty significant impairments in cognition, don't know if they're going to understand what's happening, include them anyway. We need the student to be front and center. So that they're not an object, they're a participant in the future of their education. I recommend requesting assistive technology assessments as part of IEPs and specify that you would like all things considered, low, middle, and high-tech options to optimize the student's function. Schools may push back if it isn't obvious that there could be a benefit, but I always say ask. You can be told no, but if you don't ask, you're not going to get it. And know that this may come through a representative from the intermediate school district, not your home district. The goal of assistive technology in middle school is to facilitate even greater independence. We want to make sure things like wayfinding are a part of that transition. It's a new school, it's bigger, there's new people, it's new everything. So I tend to recommend using having a preschool visit before the semester starts. Have the schedule of all the classes with them listed out and put colored Avery dots on that sheet and say, your first class is blue, it's algebra. Your next class is red, it's English. Next is, home ec, it's yellow, whatever. They don't have home ec anymore, but pretend they did. And outside of your first class, when you're going to your red class, your English class after being there, one side of the door on in a discrete spot on the wall has a red dot. It's on the right. I'm going to turn right out the door and I'm going to watch on the wall for another red dot. The second hall, there's another red dot. I'm turning right down that hall. You can set up a discrete wayfinding system to get from class to class to class that doesn't require that person to have an aid to get around, even if they have wayfinding difficulties or have mobility difficulties. And this is important, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. But the other focus is on preparedness for independent writing and reading. So this is really where we want to go heavy on copies of lesson notes, outlines of key concepts, writing stems and prompts, explicit examples for what you want modeled out as a sample assignment, pre-reading and pre-lesson questions so people know exactly what is about to happen before it happens and they know what they will be asked when they're done. The reason a lot of these things above are listed and that this idea of like increasing independence is that middle school is hard enough. That is, no one wants to be 13 again. So including personal care and private needs in that plan is important. Things like menstruation, social interactions, first kiss. No child with a disability wants a 45-year-old woman reminding them to get their book bag when a cute boy is coming up and they want to kiss them. They are mortified. If we can reduce the amount of aid support while ensuring independence and success, that's what we want to aim for. In terms of high school supports, they're the same supports as middle school, but there's a plus. This is a time that we're really thinking about after high school. Going into high school, the first thought we have is what's the plan for after? It's a time that we start thinking about things like, is this a certificate track? Is this a diploma track? Is this a, when are we going to pick that kind of thing? Is this a young adult program track? What kind of a track are we talking about? You don't have to decide this the first day. And in fact, I tell people, just wait, yeah, hold off. But by sophomore year, it's good to have a general plan about what you're talking about. Knowing that a certificate track isn't a bad thing, if the student's best plan is a certificate track, is important. A lot of parents worry that what is my kid going to do if they don't have a diploma? One of the things I tend to say is, what if they do have a diploma? Then they're competing with the general population when they may need more help. Certificate may help them get a leg up in a job they could do, but may not be competitive for without that leg up. It's a complicated conversation to talk a lot of these things through, and there is not one answer. It's a series of conversations. And the last thing that should happen is that anybody should feel rushed or pressed into any decision about tracking or paths without knowing what each offers and what are the pros and cons of each of these. This is a time to crystallize which assistive technologies best support the above noted pathways for that individual student. And so a little different from middle school, but similar to elementary school, this may actually be a time of a great burst of trying new assistive technologies. Now you have a student who may be very interested in learning about what their options are. And they're going to be more equipped to try different things and give feedback about what works for them and doesn't work for them. So student input is very important during this period. Younger kids may, their input's always important, but you may need to force things a little bit. At this age, it's what's going to work for you. And being really transparent about why you think this may be helpful for them. We need a lot of parent involvement at this point too. The other thing we want to think about is employment during high school. It is highly recommended for students with disabilities. Individuals with disabilities who work in high school are shown consistently in research to be more likely to be employed as adults. It is scary to say a student who is already overwhelmed should now, on top of it, get a job. I know that. Parents tell me that all the time. It is one of the best things you can do for that student. So thinking about how to use these technologies in employment settings would be very helpful. In terms of transition planning, we also want to think about how do we talk about the future? We want to be open, hopeful, and optimistic. The other thing we want to do is be realistic, frank, honest, and direct. I often will see IEPs where the transition planning lists activities that are wildly off base of what is viable for that person. Somebody with really severe motor difficulties who uses a lot of assistive technology for movement and mobility, listing that they plan to be a firefighter. And that's what's on the IEP. And most people can't be firefighters. There's a reason it's so competitive and difficult to become a firefighter, because lives are on the line and there's a lot of physical demand that goes with that. And there's often a problem of transition plans being overly rosy in their approach in service of saying there's no limits, you can do anything you want. There are limits for everybody. This is a universal issue. There's limits for everybody. There are jobs that are good for some people, not good for some people, physically accessible, not accessible for the body that each individual has, good fits for their cognitive style and problem solving, not good fits. This is the time to have really good conversations with students, not to knock them off of their goals, but to say, can you imagine what may be barriers to your doing that job? Open that kind of thinking up for them. Point things out. I noticed it's harder for you to move. I wonder what you might think about in firefighting that might make it harder for you to rescue somebody who's on the second floor. Can we talk that through? This is a kind of problem solving because we give this feedback to typically developing peers. We do it all the time. And to deny a student with a disability this feedback is patronizing, and we don't want to do that. We want to really do this as early as possible. And we want to think about what are the pathways. Is it a direct path to this goal? Are there going to be shorter interval educational pathways that are broken up into chunks? Maybe there's going to be a gap program in there that is a year that we just work on transition planning and independence. We want to really use the community resources here. This is where we want to remember, if you have a disability, you may not have a off-the-shelf path. You may want to be bringing in agencies to help. And plug for MI-UCP. We want to be talking through early on things like, there's a big push often for guardianship when a person has a disability. This should never be the default. It's a great option when it's appropriate, but it's one of many options. There's partial guardianship, power of attorney, supported decision-making, conservatorship. There's do nothing, just turn 18 and do nothing. We want to be proactive thinking about these. We also have things that are just typical teenager things like driver's education. This is another spot where assistive technology really comes in. Do we want an adapted driver's education program, adapted vehicles for mobility, pedal extenders, hand controls, seat adjustments? We need to make sure that it's safe for the person physically, that their decision-making skills are good for driving, and explore alternatives to driving if it turns out it's not a good fit. What are other mechanisms of transportation that we can be thinking about? It's not all or nothing. Regrettably, where you live has a big influence here. So if you live in a more rural area without a bus system or cabs, or you live too far for someone to use an accessible bike or mobility device to get to the general store, you may have more difficulties, but it's just something to be thinking about. In terms of higher education, planning for students with neurodevelopmental disabilities includes planning for, completion of high school, maybe going to an intermediate school district program or young adult program, maybe enrolling in college or a post-high school program. Like, knowing which pathway you're on is important. Colleges have student access centers or disability offices, and I'll talk more about that in a second, that provide similar supports. And you can get things like extended time for exams, copies of lecture notes, quiet spaces for your exams, scribes, other accommodations. In our state, we have specialized training options like Michigan Career Technical Institute. There's apprenticeships. There's wonderful programs in a number of communities. I'm familiar more with those in Southeast Michigan, but I know that there's multiple in the state of really learning how to have independent work skills and success. There's things like Job Corps that are federal programs and work towards different kinds of vocational tracks if you qualify from a financial perspective. Many schools and colleges are developing special programs also to work with students who have disabilities. It's good to do and it's good business for them. But these are programs that say maybe the student can't do traditional college material, but we can offer a college experience, higher level educational programming, and independent living kinds of opportunities in the space of a college environment where those social skills are essential for independence later. You really need to know, like, what's the next step? What's the goal? Are we, doing this via certificate or diploma? All of these things all tie together. When considering college, we want to think about, is a 2-year college or a 4-year college the starting point? Sometimes doing community college programming in a gradual way can be amazing. You may say, I'm going to do community college programming and start with one class the first semester. And in fact, I'm going to make this class be a non-academic class. Great. It's wonderful. It's a great way to start. All the way to I'm going to enroll in a competitive 4-year college. Everything in between. These are all good next steps. Can this individual live on their own yet? Have we done everything to prepare ahead for this? So we want to consider everything that happens: cooking, laundry, cleaning, as much as a college kid cleans, toileting, self-care, medication management, waking and sleeping cycles, again, as much as a college kid wakes and sleeps at an appropriate time, organizing their day, their work, all of this stuff. As a parent of a student who may go to college, you really want to think about, am I doing this stuff? Are they doing this stuff? Do I say they're doing it, but I'm actually constantly prompting them, and if I got zapped up by a spaceship tomorrow, none of it would happen? These are important questions to be asking yourself, for your student to be asking themselves. Some students do better staying at a local school and staying home so that they're targeting the transition to college while not also at the same time transitioning their independent living. Some students go to a dorm away at school, and that's the end of that. Like I said before, full or partial load. And then thinking about what kind of fatigue comes with the disability you have that you want to bake into how packed your schedule and self-care demands are. The other critical thing, and this goes back to the transition planning of let's be honest, is what are the next goals? Does the path of college match the target? Is the target realistic and in sight? So saying, but my kid has to go to college. Do they? Lots of things in the world don't require college. Is a trade school a fit? Well, trade schools are very competitive and hard. Is it, we don't want to think about trade school as the easier option because trade schools can be much harder than college. But where is the right fit? What is the goal? And is this path the right fit? That's always the thing we have in mind. For students who do go to college, they should really think about getting connected with the Student Disability Office. The way to do this, and all colleges have this. This is a requirement. They have to have a student access center in some form or fashion. Some are amazing, some are rotten. The first step is, before you even apply to that school, make an appointment with the Student Disability Office. If they're not willing to meet with you, don't go there. It's a terrible fit. You don't want that. Find the place that meets with you, has the right conversation. That's where your application goes, and that's where you consider going to school. You want a letter from your provider to confirm your disability. They're going to need that. If you have an IEP or 504 plan, bring a copy of that to the Student Disability Office so they can see the kinds of supports you've gotten so far and what was helpful. You, as a person going, should write a letter outlining your needs. Be proactive. Demand what you want. They may or may not agree, but go in with that as something you're bringing. call for a meeting with the office representative. And again, do so prior, but definitely when you enroll, and then meet with each instructor individually and review the student disability office agreement that you cultivate. If you want a parent involved, or if you are a parent and you want to be involved, there are pros and cons. If you continue to involve yourself, you need to know you're doing that. Because at the end of the day, if your child has gone through college all the way and you were there all the way, there isn't a magical button that a college diploma gives that suddenly your student is ready to be independent. You've just kicked the can down the road. If the goal is to really have them be independent, you want to see, can they do this without you? It's not a dump them in the deep end sort of situation. It's just we have to have an honest review of what's happening. If a parent is going to be involved, you're going to have to sign releases for that, because once you're 18, all of that changes. And then you really want to schedule follow-up communications with the Student Disability Office. Many libraries also on campus have accessibility resources and will work with students with a range of disabilities. In the workplace, you really want to be thinking about practicing disclosure conversations ahead of employment with students, and take a summary of the supports needed and request an appointment with HR to describe the previous supports and accommodations that were used in high school and college and trade school in a training program, and say, how are those relevant to my position? How can I get these things? Request an HR supported meeting with your supervisor. It can be supported with them present or not present, but just have that support from HR. Practice this interaction prior to the first real job. That's why working in high school is really important. It creates opportunities for students to practice asking for what they need to be successful. And request any assistive technology supports with the ADA representative at your HR office. And you want to, this is another plug, use community resources. There's a lot of agencies, again, such as MI-UCP, that can help optimize supports and recommendations for the work setting. In terms of takeaways, before we open this up to any questions or discussions, a lot of what I just described, it's a survey. It was just like a quick amuse-bouche of the different areas and topics where, assistive technology and transition planning intersect. Transitioning through developmental stages of early growth, elementary, middle, high school, college, and shifting into employment, there's a lot of like micro steps and stages, but you should always be thinking, with the framework of that International Classification of Functioning, how assistive technology strategically can facilitate the process if you have a disability. Use your partners, teachers, therapists, a parent or caregiver, community agencies, healthcare providers. All of these people are there to help. Don't feel like you have to do it by yourself. And if you are a healthcare provider, a community provider, a healthcare provider, use each other. Don't feel like you have to figure it out. We can't all know everything. Be open, honest, and transparent about goals, needs, and outcomes. By trying to be overly kind, politically correct, all of these things, we actually are doing a disservice to young adults with disabilities and kids with disabilities. We actually limit them. We want a life without limits. So by being honest and transparent the way we are with children and young adults who don't have disabilities, we are honoring their limitless potential. And we want to consider the whole person. We don't treat disabilities, we treat a person, a whole person. And with that, I'm going to say thank you and stop sharing my screen, and then hopefully open it up to questions.
Great. Before we move on to the questions, I just want to, on behalf of the group, say thank you so much for the presentation today before we lose more folks. And if you know someone that would benefit from this presentation but missed being present for it today, it will be on MI-UCP's YouTube channel within the next 2 weeks. I also want to just remind you to join us November 13th at 10 o'clock for an overview of the Michigan Assistive Technology Loan Fund, including exciting updates to our programs and services. And we want to thank you all for attending. And now I'd like to have any of you who have questions, please ask those of the doctor, and she'll be happy to answer. Okay, I see lots of great talks. So, does anyone have you can also raise your hand and I'll be happy to unmute you so that you can ask the question if you'd like, if that's easier for you. Okay.
I answered it
Um,
all. There's no questions because it was like everything is sorted out.
One person who had to leave, I'm just going to read her initial comment and then she said she was at a theater on Saturday and their T coil for hearing aid users was not working or clearly marked where you should sit. The staff was sympathetic but was not helpful. And then because she had to leave, she went on to say, I have to hop off for another meeting. My point was that universal design is not always a quote, set it and forget it. Someone needs to regularly check that the system to ensure that it's working. Great presentation, going through the growing process and continually assessing that the AT is appropriate and that the student is ready for it as they progress. So that was her full set of comments, if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, thanks. And I see she hopped off, but thanks to Nan Asher for that comment. That's absolutely right. I think very commonly people will put things into will sort of someone thoughtful will put something into use and then either it will break or people won't use it. I've been at conferences where people have a microphone to pass around and then people just say like, oh, it's fine, I'll talk loud. And then everybody just stops using the microphone. This is like even something basic like that, where we have to, as advocates in the community, have to raise our hand and say, I'm sorry, I need you to continue using that microphone. Or when we see things like, you know, if there's always a waste can in front of where the elevator buttons are, and you can't access it with a mobility device. You know, you can't get to the elevator button and reach around because you use a wheelchair, or that it's blocking access to something for someone who has a vision impairment. We have to go return to our community, you know, facilities and let them know that this is a problem. I I was just at dinner. I'm going to have one more example. I was just at dinner in Ann Arbor, and they have an unnamed restaurant where there's steps to go up, and there is a separate door just literally next door to go in that has a ramp. But when I called and said one of the people in my party uses a scooter, how will they get in? They said, well, when you come in, let us know and we'll open the door. I said, they're not supervised. They're coming without somebody. How are they supposed to come in and tell you?
I use a mobility device and I had a similar thing happen. I'm going back actually in a month and a half to a hotel that's not accessible. And I said, could we hold this somewhere else so that it could be accessible? And they said, but you just have to get somebody from because everybody uses all the elevators all the time. And when you're at a conference, there are multiple levels. I can never get on the elevator. It's almost impossible. And they said, but you just need to, and I explained with people with disability, we deserve to be able to move about the world like other people do without having to go get an escort from the front desk. And at the conference I was at a couple of months ago, they had to bring me through the kitchen because they had one tiny elevator that people with disabilities could use and it wasn't working. So now I understand there are times when things don't work and you make accommodation, but it's frustrating. And I have some mobility. I just don't have a lot of mobility in those spaces. But those things happen all the time where they store their extra toilet paper in the accessible stall. It's like trying to explain to the restaurant owner, this isn't accessible. They don't understand why that's not a fact. All right, so I'm going to go off of me. And Alexandra says, I'm embarrassed to admit that it never occurred to me, Peds Neuro, that getting a high school diploma might actually limit their options because it puts the patient into competition with the general population. Just one example of so many good eye-opening points made in this talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I think, all right. So if no one else has any more, please do join us in November. And thank you for being a part of this really wonderfully dynamic. There were many things said here that I've been through. I've had a transition presentation every year for the last 5 years. And Dr. Jack, I don't think there are things here that nobody's ever said. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And please call MI-UCP and look at our website. And I'm gonna, you know what, I'm gonna put it in the chat in case you haven't already been there, but
I got it. Yeah, there it goes.
awesome.
Okay. Yeah, and the presentation is available. I put it earlier in the chat if y'all want to grab that quickly before we shut down. And I want to tell Emily to be sure and bill for this additional question time. Emily, our cart provider, makes this much more accessible because I know Zoom and Google think they make good captions, but in reality, it's not the same experience for people if we don't have real-time captioning. So we make that available. All right. If everyone's had an opportunity to do those things, we're going to say thank you all for attending and get on with your day. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Jack.